the builders of Gebekli who disappeared, near the settlement of Şanlıurfa, in the parched hills of southeast Turkey, is a site so old that it completely upended our preconceived notions about human history. In the middle of the 1990s, Göbekli Potbelly Hill rose from the earth, exposing enormous, elaborate stone circles that, in contrast, made Stonehenge appear contemporary. The oldest of these megalithic enclosures, according to radiocarbon dating, is around 11,600 years old, which is a considerable time before agriculture or riding the wheel, at least as we know it. Here's the twist though. This place wasn't only built, it was buried. As if someone wanted it forgotten, the entire complex was purposefully hidden in layers upon layers of backfill. This was not a natural landslide, nor erosion. It was deliberate, systematic, almost ritualistic. The site was constructed by according to archaeologist Klaus Schmidt, who oversaw its excavation until his death in 2014. This assertion challenges the tidy chronologies of development that we have adhered to for generations. These were not meant to be monument builders, but rather basic itinerant bands. The stones, however, say otherwise. Enormous T-shaped pillars that could support up to 20 tons of weight. Some have headless human figures, vultures, lions, and scorpions, carved in relief. There are no signs of houses or farms in the area. Who were they then? What brought them here? Most eerie of all, why did they hide it all? According to some fringe scholars, it was concealed to shield it from a solar event, a comet strike, or an apocalypse. A priestly elite that kept secret. Information from an even older civilization is the subject of whispers from others. Of course, scholars continue to exercise caution. They point out that, similar to how Tibetan sand mandalas are carried away after completion, ritual burial might have been a component of the site's spiritual life cycle. The questions remain. What type of religious system existed beforehand to motivate such scale and accuracy if this was the temple of the joyful earth? How did that system disappear so thoroughly that not even a myth remained? Whether Göbekli was an isolated incident or a remnant of a larger, undiscovered tradition is still up for debate among academics. However, one thing is evident. Long ago, someone created something remarkable and then took it down. The repression of Greek technology and Rome's stolen fire. It's simple to forget who ignited the initial spark while surrounded by the Colosseum's shadow and the magnificence of Roman aqueducts. The roots of mechanics, hydraulics, and even crude robotics were established by the ancient Greeks centuries before Rome became the dominant power. However, a large portion of their inventiveness was lost to popular history, and what was left was frequently renamed after Romans. Consider Hero of Alexandria, a Greek inventor from the 1st century whose inventions resemble blueprints for the Industrial Revolution. His eye pile, a revolving sphere propelled by steam jets, was essentially the first engine ever documented in history. He constructed coin-operated machines, self-opening temple doors, and even puppet-like automatons. However, Hero's writings were largely forgotten, hardly ever cited, and hardly ever duplicated. His name is still not nearly as well known as that of the emperors whose empires fell apart due to less creative means. The majority of Hero's manuscripts survived in Arabic translations centuries after they were lost or neglected in the West. Why? Some contend that democratized technology was not very useful in Rome. Slave labor was the lifeblood of its economy. The social order might have been upset by machines that could have performed the duties of a servant. Thus, they appropriated Greek designs while stifling the creative force underlying them. Take the 1901 discovery of an anti-Thera system in a shipwreck off the coast of Greece. It remained misinterpreted for decades. Only with 21st century photography did we discover it was a complicated astronomical computer recording lunar cycles and planetary movements with astounding precision. It was nearly 1,000 years before anything even somewhat close. Dating to roughly 100 BCE, however, not a single Roman author ever brought it up. This quiet is revealing, whether the Romans were uninterested in or purposefully hid such Greek technologies to strengthen their own reputation as the forerunners of civilization is still up for debate among scholars. Under Roman rule, even the Alexandrian library, which was once a shining example of science, burned frequently. Not all of Rome's erasure was intentional, of course. The pattern endures, despite the influence of wars, deterioration, and changes. In religion, as Rome rose, Greek brilliance waned from memory, repackaged or lost. Roman arches and aqueducts are celebrated, although it is rarely recognized that many of them were modifications rather than original works. Despite its military conquest of the Greek world, the empire owed a cultural debt that had never paid in full. As a result, the distinction between imitation and preservation became hazy, putting the original flames in the shade. The conspiracy of indescript. There once was a forgotten world that throbbed with silent creativity amid the arid plains of present day. Pakistan and northwest India. Large cities, including Mohenjo-Daro, Harappa, and Dovera, were constructed by the Indus Valley Civilization, which flourished between around 22,600 and 900 BCE, complete with public restrooms, sophisticated drainage, and grid-planned streets. These individuals lived in the same era as the Mesopotamian kings and pharaohs. However, their story is still secretly stored away. Why? Because we cannot read their script. The Indescript, which was inscribed on small steatite seals, is made up of brief sequences of stylized human figures, animals, and geometric signs that are expertly engraved to imply literacy, trade, and perhaps ritual. These marks can be found on more than 4,000 items. However, no one has been able to read them despite a century of research. There has never been a multilingual Rosetta Stone released. Furthermore, some academics contend that the script is only branding marks or symbols rather than a script. All the rumors of a conspiracy begin there. These seals were discovered by British colonial archaeologists in the early 1900s. But they were mostly disregarded. The imperial story was incompatible with the idea that a literate, urbanized civilization had existed in South Asia before the arrival of the West. Later, academics from the Cold War era raised more questions, arguing that the symbols were neither grammatically or syntactically correct. That viewpoint's detractors contend that the dismissals were motivated more by academic and cultural bias than by facts. When ancient Dravidian languages like Tamil were proposed as potential keys, the dispute grew more heated. In a nation where history and identity are intricately intertwined, this would politically explosively connect the Indies to contemporary South Indian populations. Indian nationalists, on the other hand, prefer early Sanskrit connections in an effort to incorporate the history of the Indies into Hindu continuity. The outcome is a battlefield for archaeology. We read that ideology trumps data. In order to prevent cultural revolution, some fringe theorists have asserted that the script was purposefully suppressed and that specific decipherments were created, discreetly stored, and kept hidden from the general public. Although there is no proof supporting such accusations, mistrust is stoked by the lack of transparency around funding, artifact access, and the seal's sluggish digitization. Whether the Indescript is a sophisticated prototyping system or a complete language system is still up for debate among academics. However, the stakes are really high. We might discover lost disciplines, trading networks, and even new myths, if we could decipher what these individuals penned. Rather, we gaze at the same few hundred signs, questioning whether silence is mandated or just a coincidence. Because ultimately, the biggest cover-up might not be what the Indies wrote, but rather, why nobody seems interested in reading it. Tartasso's disappearance. A metropolis so rich and enigmatic that even the Greeks talked about its magnificence, once stood close to the swampy banks of the Guadalquivir River in the southwest corner of the Iberian Peninsula. According to all accounts, Tartessos was a jewel of the ancient world, a place of gold, silver, and peculiar traditions. Then, abruptly, it disappeared. According to Greek authors such as Herodotus, Tartessos was a highly developed maritime society that flourished between the 9th and 6th centuries BCE. It produced its own currency, engaged in trade with the Phoenicians, and was ruled, at least in legend, by a wise and just king named Argthonios for more than a century. However, in spite of these reports, Tartessos has never been found by archaeologists. Its language is unintelligible, its tombs are unmarked, and its capital city is still absent. An ancient society that was virtually non-existent on Earth. Where did it go then? According to some, it was lost to time and floods and buried beneath the Gedalia delta's shifting sediments. Others think that in the confusion of invasion and cultural blending, it simply lost its name and changed into later Iberian cultures. However, independent historians and fringe researchers suggested something darker. Tartessos didn't just go away. It was buried, purposefully hidden, maybe even repressed. According to the hypothesis, Tartessos posed a danger to the Phoenicians, and later the Carthaginians' monopolies on trade when they extended their power westward. According to the legend, they took its ports, turned off its electricity, and removed its name from nautical charts. Whatever remained of Tartessos was absorbed into Hispania, renamed in Latin, and lost when the Romans arrived later. Strangely, there are sporadic indications of a large, once-rich entity, including mysterious stalls, burial sites that don't precisely fit recognized Iberian patterns, and strange steles with abstract symbols. The so-called Tartessian warrior statues, which include human-shaped figures with stylized armor, were excavated in western Spain in 2015. They allude to a society that is both sophisticated and warlike. However, they solely use riddles to communicate thus far. Whether Tartessos was a myth exaggerated by Greek imagination or a real monarchy destroyed by rising nations with more enduring myths is still up for debate among scholars. However, doubts inevitably arise when a culture that was known for its literature, metalworking, and foreign diplomacy vanishes without leaving behind even a single magnificent ruin. Did time lose Tartessos? Or was it hidden beneath historical and literal layers of conquest? Its prize might have been information rather than silver, and someone made sure it remained concealed. The extinct pharaohs of Egypt. Ancient Egypt is frequently thought of as a permanent location. Everlasting hieroglyphs, stone pyramids, and golden masks that are supposed to endure forever. However, there is a curated record underneath that appearance of continuity. History was inscribed in stone by the pharaohs, indeed, but they also changed it when it was more convenient for them. Statues were shattered, faces were gouged out, names were chipped from carts, and entire reigns were cleaned from monuments. Erasing a name meant erasing a soul in ancient Egypt, Hatshepsut. The strong female pharaoh who ruled in the 15th century BCE is among the most well-known examples. She assumed the full royal title, wore the artificial beard, and oversaw a period of calm and opulent building. However, Thutmose III, her successor, had her name struck from royal lists and her pictures vandalized after her passing. Why? Was it a return to patriarchal norms or political retaliation? Or did the court want to conceal something from her reign? Then there is the heretic monarch of the 18th dynasty, Akhenaten, who worshipped a single sun disk, a 10n, above the conventional pantheon, drastically altering Egypt's religious system. He relocated the capital to the new city of Amarna and established a fluid, androgynous, nearly modern style that was unheard of in Egypt during any other period. Following his passing, his legacy was buried and his reforms were undermined by his successors, including Tutankhamun. His distinctive art was spread, his city fell apart, and his name disappeared from the walls of the temple. Egyptologists were unaware of his existence for a very long period. The removal of Smenkhare, or perhaps Neferuiten, a mysterious king who might have quarreled alongside Akhenaten or temporarily succeeded Tutankhamun, is arguably the most unsettling. Scholars continue to argue over their gender and identity. The record feels more like a redaction than a loss because it is so minimal and purposefully disguised. Why the secrecy? The rulers of Egypt were more than just political figures. They served as divine go-betweens. The validity of the entire dynastic line may be in jeopardy if one ruler's legacy was marred. As a result, structures were demolished, and tales were changed if a pharaoh's beliefs, gender, or god displeased the priests or endangered continuity. Some of these missing rulers have been recovered by contemporary archaeologists using forensic linguistics, satellite imagery, and CT scans. Previously incorrectly recognized tombs have been reclassified. Once discarded fragments are now components of a puzzle. However, several royal names are still absent. They were purposefully removed from the archives so precisely that only their absence is left. Whether these periods were exclusively political, religious, or something else entirely is still up for debate among academics. Intentional cover-ups to conceal information that could undermine future authority or ceremonial endeavors to purify a dynasty. Regardless of the motivation, ancient Egypt serves as a reminder that even a society that revered immortality was capable of rewriting its history. The name you can no longer read is sometimes the most significant. Burned truths and buried texts in China. A guy by the name of Qin Shi Huang gained authority in the 3rd century BCE with the sole purpose of bringing about unification. He had already subdued warring states, standardized weights and currencies, and started constructing the Great Wall by the time he proclaimed himself China's first emperor. However, he also accomplished something much more sinister in his quest for order. He made an effort to forget the past. Ancient records state that Qin Shi Huang conducted a massive literary cleansing in 213 BCE, referred to as the burying of scholars and the burning of books. The goal of this campaign was to eradicate other ideologies, particularly Confucian teachings that placed a strong emphasis on virtue and self-control, values deemed hazardous to a totalitarian regime. Classical ideas, poetry, history, and books, judged useless, were set on fire. Only useful guides to farming, medicine, and divination were preserved. Later records, however, provide the most terrible detail. It is said that 460 Confucian intellectuals were buried alive because they refused to turn in or submit prohibited literature. The meaning is evident whether or not the number is inflated. The past, in all its complexity and resistance, was to be permanently silenced. Although Qin's successors made an effort to undo some of the harm, the devastation was extensive. It's possible that entire schools of thinking have disappeared. According to some academics, ancient writings that existed before Confucianism, possibly even ones that contained alternative politics or cosmologies, were destroyed. Others contend that the emperor's activities were metaphysical in nature, an attempt to manipulate memory in order to control reality itself, in addition to being political. In this stillness, fringe notions thrive. According to some, the Qin dynasty discovered astronomical or technological records that were too unstable for the general public. Others contend that there was more to the mass burial of professors than a simple purging. The purpose of the ceremonial sacrifice was to enclose the knowledge that was prohibited. Ironically, though Qin Shi Huang had an obsession with immortality, he dispatched missions to find elixirs, and his tomb, which has not yet been fully excavated, is said to have a scale model of his dominion under a heavenly dome and rivers of mercury. Despite erasing all who had lived before him, it seemed that he wished to live forever. Whether the book burnings were actually as common as reported, or if the Qins were later painted as villains by Confucian embellishments, is still up for contention among academics. But the narrative stuck for a reason. Whether it was a myth or a fact, it alludes to a universal concern that the facts that are most dangerous are not those that we fight over, but rather those that are stealthily snatched from us as the smoke of burning books rises into the night without anybody noticing. They didn't want the oracle bones discovered. Chinese farmers in the vicinity of Sheon village were selling apothecarus enigmatic dragon bones, pieces of turtle shells, and ox scapulae, which were thought to have therapeutic properties. In the late 1800s, they had been crushed, boiled into tonics, and forgotten until a scholar took a close look and saw something startling. Ancient inscriptions, which date back more than 3,000 years to the Shang era circa 1200 BCE, were etched over the surfaces. Royal divination ceremonies used these oracle bones. The shells were heated until they broke, then questions were cut. Into them, priests interpreted the resulting patterns and occasionally wrote the answers next to the initial questions. These were not merely mystical relics. They contained kings' names, eclipse records, war and harvest narratives, and other historical texts. China's long-forgotten forefathers seemed to have murmured through the ages, only to have their voices muffled once again by superstition and dust. This is where it becomes peculiar, though. These bones had been recognized locally for generations. However, their importance was not acknowledged. Many were destroyed before they could be viewed by scholars. Additionally, attempts to gather and examine them were sluggish, dispersed, and occasionally purposefully impeded, even after their importance was recognized in the early 20th century. They were disregarded as superstitious by some Chinese elites. Western academics of the colonial era, however, minimized their significance in world chronology. Additionally, in order to avoid ideological contamination during political upheavals, such as the Japanese occupation or the Cultural Revolution, entire stockpiles were destroyed, robbed, or buried. Politics now shattered the bones that had been broken by fire. Why the opposition? Some people think the preferred historical narrative was upset by the oracle bones. Human sacrifice, intertwined with blood and bone, was a practice of the Shang monarchs. In a nation that values continuity and moral leadership, that is an unsettling reality. Others draw attention to the script's own meanings. The sophistication and consistency of these inscriptions point to a far older writing tradition that we have not yet discovered. The lost dynasties that existed before the Shang, whose records were erased, are the subject of speculation by fringe thinkers. Others allude to non-Han cultures, whose impact was later minimized or absorbed. They claim that the bones were the last remnants of a past that no one wanted to be rekindled. Whether the oracle bones represent the earliest authentic Chinese writing, or only the earliest that remained, is still up for contention among academics. Each piece, however, narrates the tale of voices that were formerly ignored but are now partially heard. Perhaps most horrifyingly, we have already destroyed things without ever realizing their value. Questions that were previously asked in fire still have answers that linger just beneath the surface. There is no discussion regarding the American giants. Early settlers discovered something disturbing throughout the American heartland, from the Mississippi River Valley to the foothills of the Appalachians. Enormous skeletons that are frequently interred in mounds with odd objects. Newspapers from the 19th and early 20th centuries were filled with stories about bones that were 7 to 9 feet tall and discovered in earthen barrows, coffins lined with stone, and burial chambers. Publications such as Scientific American, the New York Times, and other local gazettes carried the tales. Then they came to a halt. Originally used to refer to the enigmatic builders of these burial mounds, the term mound builders was later associated with recognized indigenous groups such as the Adena, Hopewell, and Mississippians. However, the giants gradually disappeared from academic discourse. Many of the bones were never catalogued, were given to museums, or vanished into private collections. Some say the Smithsonian took them, but they disappeared without a trace. Naturally, the assertion is debatable. The tall skeletons are explained by modern archaeology as either exaggerated measurements or misidentified persons with genetic defects like gigantism. The Smithsonian Institution formally denies hiding any such finds. Inconsistencies still exist, though. Skeletons whose proportions defy understanding can be seen in old pictures. Double rows of teeth, enlarged skulls, and peculiar burial rites are all mentioned in early excavation diaries. Are they all romantic embellishments, misprints, or hoaxes? These oddities, according to some experts, were inconvenient to the dominant narratives in order to defend westward migration. There was a major drive in the 1800s to disassociate Native American traditions with past complexity. After indigenous histories regained such locations, the notion of a vanished riser, distinct, ancient people who constructed the mounds was bolstered. Neither tale fit the giants. They were too weird, too messianic. Others go beyond. According to fringe theories, these giants might have been Nephilim, the mythical children of humans and gods according to biblical lore. Or they might have been survivors of a lost migration, a price-aged race whose stature and wisdom had been lost to time. There are even rumors of foreign visits or genetic experimentation. A stretch, to be sure, but one that highlights how unsettling the giant's story grew. Whether these stories were fraught, folklore, or misinterpretation is still up for debate among academics. Despite the fact that early American archaeology was frequently unregulated and records were disorganized, the sheer number of reports, more than 1,500 recorded finds, raises legitimate concerns. Were these individuals all just wrong? The loss of many historical papers, photographs, and sites due to development or agriculture is more concerning. We don't just have no answers. the evidence required to pose more insightful queries has been lost. And perhaps, just possibly, someone ensured that the desert library, a Buddhist monk named Wang Yuanlu, discovered a locked room inside the Mowawo caves at Dunhuang, which are located in the isolated deserts of western China, close to the edge of the Taklamakan Desert. In 1900, there was an unimaginable treasure. In the cave, concealed beneath a thin plaster and paint wall, scrolls, silk banners, drawings, and texts numbering in the tens of thousands. Some of them, which covered astronomy, medicine, mathematics, theology, and daily life, go all the way back to the 4th century. However, there has never been a satisfactory explanation for this discovery. Local leaders were hesitant to celebrate the discovery. Poor and keen to preserve the pieces, Wang sold a large portion of the collection to foreign explorers like Aspel, Pellet, and Aurel Stein for pitiful prices. The explorers then transported trunkloads of the scrolls back to London and Paris. For years, Chinese officials took no action to protect or promote the surviving contents. They resealed the cave. The narrative waned. Why, therefore, would one of the most important literary discoveries in human history, sometimes referred to as the Library of the Silk Road, be concealed, forgotten, and then peacefully scattered? Some people think the cave was shut long before. The monk discovered it, maybe to save its contents from religious iconoclasm, nomadic incursions, or political purges. Others cite oddly sophisticated writings among the scrolls, astronomical charts that line up with remarkable accuracy early, accounts of illnesses and cures that were long believed to be contemporary, and allusions to books that have vanished and that we have yet to locate. Among them was the Diamond Sutra, which dates to 868 CE and is the oldest printed book in the world. Its printing method, however, seems out of place and suggests knowledge that was well beyond its time. Some theorists even assert that some scrolls were purposefully taken out of circulation before researchers arrived, concealed in private collections, or maybe in unopened secret archives. Rumor has it that the Maggio complex contains further locked rooms, locations that are known but have not been explored, either because of political red tape or a tacit understanding that what is inside could make everything too complicated. Whether the Dunan Cave was a purposeful archive, sealed as a time capsule, or out of desperation, or if it was a random collection, is still up for debate among scholars. However, one thing cannot be denied. Its contents may change our understanding of the movement of information from antiquity to modernity and from east to west. And how many more are buried there, ready to speak like forgotten memories, if this was only one cave in one desert? Is Atlantis an actual location or merely a diversion? Atlantis is one of the few old mysteries that has captured the curiosity of the modern world. Around 360 BCE, Plato described a vast island society. According to his story, Atlantis was a philosophical and engineering utopia that became conceited, disobeyed the gods, and was engulfed by the sea. Scholars, visionaries, and opportunists have been searching for its remnants under glaciers, deserts, and waves for more over 2,000 years. However, in spite of all the conjecture, no conclusive evidence has ever been discovered. The bigger puzzle, however, lies here. How come so many people are interested in this vanished civilization? The only ancient source is Plato's story, which is even indirectly credited to the Egyptian priests through the Athens statesman Solon. It is considered by mainstream historians to be an allegory, a myth-encased political fable. However, The amount of work put into demonstrating the existence of Atlantis has outstripped the investigation of real-life lost cities, such as Caral, Mohenjo-daro, or Tartessos. More realistic ruins are overshadowed by Atlantis, which takes center stage in the discussion. According to some, this wasn't an accident. The notion of a lost superior Atlantic race that preceded Western supremacy was conveniently alluring throughout the 19th and 20th centuries, when colonial countries attempted to trace civilization's origins to Europe. Atlantis projected contemporary values back into the past, acting as a cultural stand-in. The myth was broadened by fringe writers who asserted that Atlantans possessed airships, psychic powers, and sophisticated technology. The calm realities coming from actual excavation sites were overshadowed by these tales. In the meantime, voices pointing to Mediterranean land masses that had been submerged, such as the volcanic collapse of Santorini and the Minoan civilization it devastated, were frequently muffled. The search for a legend shrouded in impossibility was prompted by the actual evidence of a highly developed Bronze Age culture that might have matched some of Plato's story. The plot gets more complicated at this point. Some people think that the emphasis on Atlantis was purposefully exaggerated in order to divert attention from other more destructive historical periods, from hidden technology that are difficult to explain within academic systems to societies whose accomplishments precede recognized eras. To put it briefly, Atlantis evolved into a great, romantic, and conveniently unverifiable safe mystery. Whether Plato spun Atlantis from whole cloth or borrowed from ancient sources is still up for discussion among academics. What few dispute, nevertheless, is its impact. It has diverted attention from more subdued remains that don't fit neat narratives, but have the potential to more dramatically alter the ancient world. Perhaps Atlantis never existed. Perhaps it was a mirror reflecting our unwillingness to confront the past rather than the past itself. In conclusion, how do we interpret it all? The same pattern recurs across periods and continents, from lost cities to literature that are prohibited. Wonder, discovery, and silence. These historical cover-ups weren't all the result of chance. They were silent erasers, calculated discharges, and intentional actions. Keeping the rest of us in the dark was always advantageous to someone. However, truth has an odd way of regaining its position. The past left its mark on myth, on stone, and even in the bloodlines of extinct peoples, regardless of how well it has been rewritten or how deeply it has been buried. And we can see through the mists if we examine them closely, not with the haughtiness of the modern world, but with modest curiosity. We discover that history is more than just a chronicle of events. It's a battlefield of what was permitted to endure. We are told that civilization originated in a single location. We are instructed to believe the approved version of the story, which includes the timeline, maps, and names. However, the more we learn, the more obvious it becomes. That version is refined, edited, and incomplete. Furthermore, it is possible that the reality is much older and more bizarre than we previously thought. After all, it's not only about the bones, the ruins, or the scrolls. It's about posing the one question that history is most afraid to answer: what we weren't supposed to.